When he called me useless for asking to borrow the car I was personally paying for, I realized that for the last few years I had been living in some kind of sick, self-invented reality. I had just lost my father, but perhaps, in that instant, I found myself. Ironic, isn't it? To hear the most hurtful word from the person closest to you, you first had to give him everything you had. In that moment, in our small living room, saturated with the scent of his expensive cologne and my disappointment, I felt an absolute, ringing finality. It wasn't a shouting match or a quarrel involving broken dishes. It was a quiet, cold severing. But to truly understand how that one phrase broke me, you first need to understand why I was in a position where I had to beg for anything at all. My entire life had been structured around a single goal: to give Robert, my father Bob, the life he had set aside for me. He was that type of working-class man you rarely see anymore. He would wake up before dawn, 5 days a week, to work in the auto parts warehouse, where it always smelled of machine oil and sweat, and he would return when the city was already asleep. My mother left when I was only 8, and Bob became my whole world. He never spoke about the sacrifices, but I saw them. I saw his calloused hands, his perpetually tired eyes, which nevertheless lit up with pride when he bought me a new school notebook, or, at age 12, an old but perfectly repainted blue bicycle. He told me then, "So you, Ethan, can ride wherever you want. Into a world that doesn't smell like this warehouse." Those words became my unspoken oath. I had to get him out of there. And I did. I didn't become a mechanic like him. I went a different route. Whether through luck or sheer hard work, by the time I was 25, I was working as a senior analyst at a tech company, earning money that both my father and I had never seen, not even in movies. The first thing I did after securing that solid contract was approach him. He was sitting on the couch then, watching some old baseball game, looking every bit of his 60 years, though he was only 59. I told him, "Dad, that's it. You're fired. Go home and never return to that warehouse. I'll cover everything now." Tears stood in his eyes, and he hugged me as tightly as he could. He initially resisted, not wanting to be a burden, but I insisted. I told him it was my duty, my honor, and that it was his turn to enjoy life. I truly believed what I was saying. For the first few months, everything was perfect. I gave him a credit card, linked to my personal accounts, and told him not to worry about the limit. I bought him new clothes so he wouldn't wear his old, warehouse-smelling outfits anymore. My biggest gift was membership to the Lakeside Club, a very expensive, private country club, the kind of place simple working men like Bob would never even step inside. It had golf, a swimming pool, and a restaurant with a menu whose names Bob, I'm sure, couldn't pronounce, but that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted him to feel important, to meet people living a different life. He would return from there beaming, telling stories about his new acquaintances, some lawyer who owned a yacht, or a restaurant chain owner. I listened, and an overwhelming, almost physical pleasure grew inside me. I had finally repaid the debt. The problem started precisely with that club. I don't know what those successful people did to him there, but something in my father gradually broke. Initially, he was grateful, then he simply got used to it. And then, he started demanding. It didn't happen overnight. It was like a creeping, slow poison. At first, the phrases were harmless. "This club is fine, Ethan, but there's one in the capital, entry only by recommendation." Or, "The guys there only wear Rolex watches, mine looks a little cheap." I dismissed it, thinking it was just his reaction to the new, unfamiliar environment. But the comments became more frequent, more pointed, and personal. He began acting as if all this was his by right. He might make a cutting remark that our old dishwasher was a disgrace for a man who pays his membership fee. But the real blow came one evening when we were watching a movie. He suddenly turned off the TV and looked at me with a cold, alien expression. He said that he had slaved away in that warehouse his whole life, and I, at 25, got all this simply by chance. He said it wasn't fair. I was stunned. He wasn't happy for my success. he envied it. He started seeing me not as a son who kept his promise, but as a competitor who had somehow bypassed him, or, even worse, as a wallet that wasn't filling up fast enough. He began openly asking for money for investments, with his new friends from the club, never explaining what these investments were. He wanted me to pay for a trip to the Bahamas because everyone there has been. I was working 12 hours a day to support his lifestyle, and he was demanding I try harder. This was no longer my father. This was a parasite I had grown myself with my own money. And so, after almost a year of this life, at the beginning of this month, everything peaked. My old, reliable sedan broke down. The repair required a rare part and would take a week. My job in the city center, where there's no public transport access, required a car. I had an obvious, ready, fully paid for by me car, the new, red sports car I had gifted Bob for his birthday 6 months prior, and for which I was still making huge monthly payments. I approached him, trying to speak as calmly as possible. Dad, can I use the red car for a week? Mine is in the shop. He didn't even look up from watching golf on TV. First, he just grimaced, then he sized me up and delivered the very phrase that changed everything. No, Ethan. That's my car. I need it. And you? You're useless if you can't afford a second car. Buy your own, and stop bothering me. Useless. I, who paid for his life, his club, his clothes, his house, and his pride, was called useless for asking to borrow his own gift. At that moment I understood, this debt was paid. Overpaid, in fact. The word useless hung in the air, heavier and more toxic than any silence could have been, and for a long time, though it was probably only 30 seconds, either of us moved. Bob didn't even turn his head back to the golf tournament on the screen. He simply stared forward, satisfied with the damage he had inflicted. I realized that the argument wasn't actually about the car at all, and it never had been about the money or the club. It was about control and envy. He needed me to be small, to be the grateful son who looked up to him, even now, even when I was the one signing the checks, because it validated the decades he spent on that filthy warehouse floor. But I had become too big, too successful, and in his mind, my success minimized his sacrifice, turning it into a failure instead of a foundation. His bitterness had metastasized into contempt, and I was the vessel carrying the disease. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to say to the man who was sitting there, cloaked in designer clothes I paid for, in a house I rented for him, protecting the keys to a sports car whose monthly payment was currently draining my own bank account. Arguing would have just confirmed his position that I was, in fact, a nuisance, an annoyance interrupting his well-funded leisure. Instead, I just said very quietly, a sound that felt brittle and sharp. I'm done, Bob. Done. He gave a dismissive grunt, a low, satisfied sound that didn't even require him to acknowledge my presence fully. That indifference was the final, irreversible push I needed. I went to my room, the small, cramped space that was once my childhood sanctuary, now reduced to an afterthought in the opulent lifestyle I'd created for him. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the sudden, terrifying clarity of what I was about to do. I started packing. Not logically, not carefully, just grabbing what fit into 2 duffel bags, my laptop, some basic clothes, and the few old books I still owned from college. Every item I stuffed into the bag felt like a shovel full of dirt on the grave of the relationship I thought we had. I kept flashing back to the bright blue bicycle, the scent of fresh paint, the pride in his eyes, and then the immediate, crushing disappointment on his face when I unveiled the red sports car for his birthday. The man who treasured that cheap, used bike was gone, replaced by this entitled, arrogant stranger who was never satisfied. The decision to leave was instantaneous, but the decision to cut the money supply, to truly sever the financial umbilical cord, was agonizing. It felt like homicide. He was my father, the man who had sheltered me and fed me. But then the word useless echoed, and I realized he hadn't protected me for years. He had been using me. If I left and kept paying, nothing would change. He would continue his life of expensive golf and dismissive insults, while I would be homeless and miserable, still funding his contempt. I had to rip off the bandage, and it had to happen immediately, proving that the useless son held all the power. I found a rental listing online for a tiny, one-bedroom apartment near my office. It was cheap, far from elegant, and available immediately. I paid the deposit and first month's rent on my phone while sitting on my own unmade bed. The entire transaction took less than 10 minutes and felt like the most adult, independent thing I had done in years. The house he was living in was leased under my name, the credit card was my corporate account, and the car loan was solely my responsibility. He had nothing tied to his own name anymore. He had outsourced his entire life to me, and that was the leverage I now had to use. When I was ready to leave, my duffel bags by the door, he finally stirred. He didn't ask where I was going. He just gave me the look of a landlord inspecting a tenant who was leaving overdue rent. "Going somewhere, Ethan?" he asked, not with concern, but with detached curiosity. I told him I was moving out. He actually laughed, a short, dry, utterly contemptuous sound. "Go ahead. But the bills still get paid, the club membership renews next week, and the car payment is due on the 15th. Don't be an idiot and jeopardize my life because you're having a tantrum." That's when the new, firm resolution took hold. I looked directly at him, the man who was now just Bob, and said the words I knew would change his world, and mine forever. "No, Bob. None of that is getting paid. The club is cancelled. The card is cancelled. The lease here is cancelled. And the car payment on the 15th? You'll have to take care of that yourself." His face changed instantly. The casual mask of superiority dissolved, replaced by a deep, ugly red flush of shock and rage. "You can't do that! I raised you! You owe me!" he roared, finally standing up, his expensive silk shirt wrinkling as he moved. But I didn't stop. I walked out the door and didn't look back. The first thing I did, the next morning, was call the bank. I explained I was closing the account associated with his credit card. I called the club, the Lakeside Club, and canceled the membership, paying the substantial cancellation fee just to make sure it was done instantly. Then, I made the call to the dealership. I was polite but firm. "I will not be making the next payment on the red convertible," I told the representative. "The collateral is the vehicle itself. Please proceed with repossession on the scheduled date." They were stunned. I knew this would set off alarms for him quickly, but I couldn't afford to keep paying for a car he used as a weapon against me. I had cut him off completely, financially, morally, and emotionally, all within the first 2 days of this brutal, decisive month. I hadn't yet seen the real consequences of my actions, but I felt a cold, hard sense of freedom, the kind that tastes like ash and possibility. The first week in my new apartment felt less like freedom and more like a cramped, airless bunker. The walls were thin, the alley outside was constantly loud, and the old mattress felt like a physical reminder of the comfort I had given up. But it was mine, and every scratch on the paint and every rattle of the window was a sign that I was building something for myself again. I was alone, and that isolation gave me the necessary shield against the onslaught that was coming, which I knew was inevitable. The calls started exactly 72 hours after I walked out, which was just after the bank formally rejected Bob's latest attempt to use the cancelled credit card at a high-end golf pro shop. His first message was simple. "You're a selfish mistake. Fix this immediately." Then came the calls, starting frantic and quickly turning ugly. He was screaming about the power being shut off, about the internet being disconnected in the middle of his golf channel, and about the landlord posting an eviction notice on the door. He demanded to know how I could do this to the man who gave me everything. I didn't answer. I didn't text back. I simply let the screen light up with his name, letting the ringing absorb his rage while I focused on the spreadsheets on my laptop. But the real, immediate pressure wasn't coming from his anger. It was coming from my own rapidly collapsing finances. When I cut the cord, I failed to factor in the sheer cost of severance. Canceling the club membership came with a termination penalty that ate up almost half of my modest savings. Breaking the lease on the house meant forfeiting a huge security deposit. On top of that, the dealership warned me that if the car was repossessed, I would likely still be liable for the deficiency balance, the difference between the outstanding loan amount and what they managed to sell the used car for at auction. Suddenly, the money I had planned to save for a down payment on my own small place was instead being funneled into the wreckage of his abandoned life. I was working overtime, trying to cover the immediate cash shortfall caused by these penalties and by the need to furnish my tiny space. I was running on 4 hours of sleep, fueled by bad coffee and the adrenaline of panic, and that stress started bleeding into my professional life. My attention span, which had once earned me my senior role, was fractured. I missed a key deadline on a presentation to a major client. My boss, Mr. Hayes, called me into his office and asked if everything was all right, his tone not accusatory, but deeply concerned. I couldn't tell him. "Oh, I'm just trying to pay off the residual debt from the luxury car I gave to my estranged father who called me useless." I just gave him some vague, non-committal answer about unforeseen family issues. But the look in his eyes told me I was on thin ice. The job I had worked so hard for, the very source of the money Bob had demanded, was now at risk because of him, even though I had physically left. The situation with the Lakeside Club was the tipping point in terms of pure, humiliating tension. On Friday, the day his membership officially expired, Bob went there anyway. I received a barrage of texts that afternoon. They weren't from him. They were from an acquaintance I had made through a work event, someone I had briefly introduced to Bob months ago. The messages were discreet, but the details were sharp. Bob had caused a scene. He had tried to charge drinks to his inactive account, argued loudly with the manager, and was eventually escorted off the premises by security. He was ranting about my ungrateful son, and how Ethan is ruining me. I wasn't there, but the second-hand shame was a suffocating blanket. My professional circle was small, and now his humiliation was leaking out, threatening the reputation I had spent years building. The next communication from Bob wasn't a call. It was a physical, handwritten note shoved under the door of my new, shabby apartment. It was week 3 now, and the note was not a demand, it was a desperate plea for forgiveness, which was a chilling new tactic. He apologized for calling me useless, but the apology was thin, sandwiched between paragraphs detailing how cold the house was without electricity, and how he was starving because he couldn't even buy gas for the stove. "I'm your father, Ethan. I'm sick. I need the club doctors. Please, just pay for the essentials. Just until I get back on my feet." This shift, from aggressive entitlement to pathetic vulnerability, was the cruelest move yet. It dug deep into the residual guilt I still carried, the 12-year-old boy who promised to save his hero. The note wasn't a genuine expression of love, it was a strategic weapon. I knew if I gave him an inch, he'd take back the mile I had fought so hard to reclaim. But ignoring a grown man pleading for food and warmth felt like I was betraying everything the old Bob had taught me. I crumpled the note, but the words, and the moral dilemma they represented, felt heavy in my gut. I was paying a crushing financial price, and now I was paying an even steeper emotional price. The time for the next car payment was rapidly approaching, and I knew its failure would set off the final, unavoidable crisis. The crumpled note with Bob's desperate plea sat like a grenade in the corner of my tiny apartment, and for 3 days, it paralyzed me. The guilt was a suffocating physical weight, a constant echo of the boy who had once sworn to protect the man. I knew he was cold, I knew he was scared, and I knew I was the sole cause of his immediate misery. But every time I reached for my phone, the image of his arrogant, sneering face, the one that had called me useless, slammed into my conscience, reminding me that the man I was trying to save was dead, replaced by a monster of his own making. The moral dilemma was visceral. Do I save the man who raised me, knowing he will immediately turn my kindness back into a weapon, or do I save myself, letting him face the harsh, painful reality he created? I decided to choose myself, a decision that felt both empowering and profoundly lonely. I focused on work, trying to make up for the missed deadline, but the distraction was still palpable. I felt constantly on edge, waiting for the inevitable escalation. The climax of this agonizing waiting game arrived on a Tuesday morning, the day the car payment was due. I was in a high-stakes meeting with Mr. Hayes and the client I had nearly lost when my personal phone, which I had forgotten to silence, buzzed insistently. It wasn't just a ring, it was a furious, prolonged vibration, like a trapped insect. I immediately excused myself, knowing it had to be Bob, but when I looked at the screen, it was a blocked number, followed by a text message that was chillingly precise and clearly not from him. The text was short. He says you stole his inheritance. Pay the car or the police get the paperwork. We both know you can't afford this fight. I walked straight out of the building. The air outside was cold, but I was sweating. Inheritance? What was that supposed to mean? Bob had no inheritance to give. He had worked a factory job his entire life and lived paycheck to paycheck until I took over. I paced the street, heart hammering against my ribs, rereading the cryptic message. It implied that Bob wasn't just broke and begging, he was actively creating a narrative, a dangerous, legally volatile narrative, to force my hand. This wasn't just about guilt anymore, it was about coercion and potential fraud. I decided to track down the source. I used a back-channel contact I knew from my early days in data analysis, a favor I knew I'd have to repay dearly, to trace the burner number. It took 4 hours and cost me a favor worth thousands of dollars, but the result was a name, Victor Harding. He wasn't a lawyer, he was a notorious, small-time debt collector and hustler who operated on the fringes of legitimate business, known for leveraging petty threats and exploiting emotional vulnerabilities. Bob hadn't gone to the police, he had gone to the darkest corner of the Lakeside Club, connections he had fostered, the kind of person who dealt in leverage and manipulation. The inheritance story was a lie, a fabricated legal pressure point meant to terrify me into making the payment just to make the threat disappear. The true, gut-wrenching plot twist came 2 days later. The dealership called, not to confirm repossession, but to tell me there was a problem. They had come for the red sports car, but Bob had hidden it. Worse, he had gone to a notary public and, using a forged power of attorney or some similar fraudulent paperwork, had attempted to transfer the car title out of my name. The dealership was filing a report for vehicle theft and fraud, and guess whose name was on the loan as the primary debtor? Mine. Bob had tried to steal the vehicle that was already his to use, only he wanted it free and clear, leaving me with the massive, multi-year debt. My anger finally boiled over, cleanly replacing the guilt. This wasn't a father in distress. This was a thief trying to execute a calculated, complex con. I called Bob. This was the first time I had spoken to him in 3 weeks, and my voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the calmness of absolute, lethal control. Bob, I said. The police have been notified about the red car. You have until the end of the week to return it to the dealership. If you don't, the fraud charges will move forward, and they won't be against me. There was a long silence, and then his voice, no longer pathetic, but a shaky, high-pitched scream of pure panic. You wouldn't! They'll put me in jail! You can't put your own father in jail! I didn't do this, Bob, I replied, the words feeling heavy and definitive. You did. You chose the thief over the son. You chose to call me useless, and then tried to ruin me. Now you need to decide who you want to be when the repo man and the police come knocking. You have until Friday. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel relief, I felt cold, surgical resolve. The battle was over, the endgame was set. I just had to wait for the final, brutal confrontation. The final 2 days leading up to my Friday deadline were the longest of my life. I went through the motions at work, physically present but mentally miles away, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the inevitable surrender or the final, destructive act. The car loan deficiency, the fraud investigation, the police, it all hung over me, but the fear was overshadowed by a strange, hard certainty. I had done the right thing, even if it was the cruelest thing. I had prioritized my sanity over his entitlement. On Thursday evening, the day before my deadline, I finally got the call. It wasn't from Bob. It was from Victor Harding, the debt collector and hustler who had sent the cryptic inheritance text. His voice was low, laced with forced respect that didn't quite cover the venom. "Ethan, your father asked me to mediate," Victor said, his tone slick and unpleasant. "Look, the old man's got no cash. He's sleeping on his cousin's couch now. He says he made a mistake. He says he'll return the car tomorrow if you call off the dealership and promise to send him just a little monthly stipend, enough for food and a new phone." It was the final negotiation, the last desperate attempt to turn my action into a negotiable loss instead of a total defeat. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was asking for severance pay. "Victor," I replied, my voice steady, "tell Bob that if the car is at the dealership by 5 p.m. tomorrow, I will ensure the dealership drops the fraud report related to the title attempt. That's the only negotiation. The money stops now, and it stops forever. His life is no longer my responsibility. He chose this when he called me useless." I hung up, deleting Victor's number immediately. I had given him a clear path out of a felony charge, nothing more. The actual climax arrived on Friday at 4:55 p.m. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the clock, my stomach twisting into a knot. I got a text message from the general manager of the dealership, not a cheerful one, but a clipped professional notification. It read, "Vehicle is here. Driver fled on foot immediately upon delivery. Papers signed. Repo is clean." I closed my laptop and leaned back, letting out a breath I felt I'd been holding since I was 12. It was done. The car was gone, the fraud charges were dropped, and the debt, while still technically mine to resolve with the bank, was no longer a threat hanging over my head. More importantly, Bob had chosen freedom over jail, but he had been forced to surrender every last vestige of the luxurious life I had built for him. I didn't hear from him again. Not that day, not the next week. The silence was absolute, a profound, empty space where endless demands and toxic commentary used to be. The resolution of the immediate conflict was swift, but the emotional resolution has been slow and enduring. Within a week, the bank had finished its internal review and informed me I was liable for a 5-figure deficiency balance on the repossessed car. It was a painful, expensive lesson, but I paid it off by liquidating some stock options, choosing to pay the penalty for my father's choices just to close the book entirely. I moved on. I stabilized my career, and the small, cramped apartment slowly started to feel like a real home. About a month after the car was returned, I got a vague, second-hand update through my old coworker. Bob had left the cousin's couch. He had apparently taken a minimum-wage night job as a security guard, ironically, in a warehouse just like the one he left. The coworker said he was bitter, constantly complaining about his ungrateful son, who had stolen his inheritance. The lie was still being maintained. He was back to the life he had fought so hard to escape, but this time, without the quiet dignity he once possessed. Hearing this didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought me a cold, hard sadness. I realized that my father's tragedy wasn't his lack of money, it was his inability to find happiness without dependence. I hadn't lost my father the day I cut him off. I lost the idea of him years ago, when the money poisoned his soul and turned love into a transaction. I saved myself, but I destroyed the fantasy he was living. The debt I owed him for raising me was long paid, but the cost of that repayment was the permanent loss of our relationship. I am now 35, financially stable, and I own my own small condo. There are no expensive sports cars in my driveway. Sometimes I look out the window and wonder if he's out there, somewhere in the cold, still waiting for that mythical inheritance I supposedly stole. Was my decision an act of necessary self-preservation, or did I simply become as cruel and transactional as he was? I don't know the answer, and I suspect I never will.